This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Michelle Crandall, Fremont, California, August 2006. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 26, Monsieur de Rivarol. Captain Blood was still in that disgruntled mood when he sailed from Tortuga, and still in that mood when he came to his moorings in the bay of Petit Goave. In that same mood he greeted Monsieur le Baron de Rivarol, when this nobleman, with his fleet of 5 men of war, at last dropped anchor alongside the buccaneer ships in the middle of February. The Frenchman had been 6 weeks on the voyage, he announced, delayed by unfavorable weather. Summoned to wait on him, Captain Blood repaired to the castle of Petit Goave, where the interview was to take place. The Baron, a tall, hawk-faced man of 40, very cold and distant of manner, measured Captain Blood with an eye of obvious disapproval. Of Hagthorpe, Yberville, and Wolverstone, who stood ranged behind their captain, he took no heed whatever. Monsieur de Cousset offered Captain Blood a chair. "A moment, Monsieur de Cousset. I do not think Monsieur le Baron has observed that I am not alone. Let me present to you, sir, my companions, Captain Hagthorpe of the Elizabeth, Captain Wolverstone of the Atropos, and Captain Yberville of the Lachesis." The Baron stared hard and haughtily at Captain Blood, then very distantly and barely perceptibly inclined his head to each of the other 3. His manner implied plainly that he despised them, and that he desired them at once to understand it. It had a curious effect upon Captain Blood. It awoke the devil in him, and it awoke at the same time his self-respect, which of late had been slumbering. A sudden shame of his disordered, ill-kempt appearance made him perhaps the more defiant. There was almost a significance in the way he hitched his sword-belt round, so that the wrought hilt of his very serviceable rapier was brought into fuller view. He waved his captains to the chairs that stood about. "Draw up to the table, lads. We are keeping the Baron waiting." They obeyed him, Wolverstone with a grin that was full of understanding. Haughtier grew the stare of Monsieur de Rivarol. To sit at table with these bandits placed him upon what he accounted a dishonoring equality. It had been his notion that, with the possible exception of Captain Blood, they should take his instructions standing, as became men of their quality in the presence of a man of his. He did the only thing remaining to mark a distinction between himself and them. He put on his hat. "You're very wise now," said Blood amiably. "I feel the draught myself," and he covered himself with his plumed castor. Monsieur de Rivarol changed colour. He quivered visibly with anger, and was a moment controlling himself before venturing to speak. Monsieur de Cousset was obviously very ill at ease. "Sir," said the Baron frostily, "you compel me to remind you that the rank you hold is that of Capitaine de Vaisseau, and that you are in the presence of the General of the armies of France by sea and land in America. You compel me to remind you further that there is a deference due from your rank to mine." "I am happy to assure you," said Captain Blood, "that the reminder is unnecessary. I am by way of accounting myself a gentleman, little though I may look like one at present, and I should not account myself that I were capable of anything but deference to those whom nature or fortune may have placed above me, or to those who, being placed beneath me in rank, may labour under a disability to resent my lack of it." It was a neatly intangible rebuke. Monsieur de Rivarol bit his lip. Captain Blood swept on without giving him time to reply. "Thus much being clear, shall we come to business?" Monsieur de Rivarol's hard eyes considered him a moment. "Perhaps it will be best," said he. He took up a paper. I have here a copy of the articles into which you entered with Monsieur de Cousset. Before going further, I have to observe that Monsieur de Cousset has exceeded his instructions in admitting you to 1/5 of the prizes taken. His authority did not warrant his going beyond 1/10. That is a matter between yourself and Monsieur de Cousset, my general. Oh, no, it is a matter between myself and you. Your pardon, my general. The articles are signed. So far as we are concerned, the matter is closed. Also, out of regard for Monsieur de Cousset, we should not desire to be witnesses of the rebukes you may consider that he deserves. What have I to say to Monsieur de Cousset is no concern of yours. That is what I am telling you, my general. But, nom de Dieu, it is your concern, I suppose, that we cannot award you more than 1/10 share. Monsieur de Rivarol smote the table in exasperation. The pirate was too infernally skilful a fencer. You are quite certain of that, Monsieur le Baron, that you cannot? I am quite certain that I will not. Captain Blood shrugged and looked down his nose. In that case, said he, it but remains for me to present my little account for our disbursement, and to fix the sum at which we should be compensated for our loss of time and derangement in coming hither. That settled, we can part friends, Monsieur le Baron. No harm has been done. What the devil do you mean? The Baron was on his feet, leaning forward across the table. Is it possible that I am obscure? My French, perhaps, is not of the purest, but... Oh, your French is fluent enough. Too fluent at moments, if I may permit myself the observation. Now, you look here, Monsieur de Filibustier. I am not a man with whom it is safe to play the fool, as you may very soon discover. You have accepted service of the King of France, you and your men. You hold the rank and draw the pay of a capitaine de vaisseau, and these, your officers, hold the rank of lieutenants. These ranks carry obligations which you would do well to study, and penalties for failing to discharge them which you might study at the same time. They are something severe. The first obligation of an officer is obedience. I commend it to your attention. You are not to conceive yourselves, as you appear to be doing, my allies in the enterprises I have in view, but my subordinates. In me you behold a commander to lead you, not a companion or an equal. You understand me, I hope? Oh, be sure that I understand. Captain Blood laughed. He was recovering his normal self amazingly under the inspiring stimulus of conflict. The only thing that marred his enjoyment was the reflection that he had not shaved. I forget nothing, I assure you, my general. I do not forget, for instance, as you appear to be doing, that the articles we signed are the condition of our service, and the articles provide that we receive 1/5 share. Refuses that, and you cancel the articles. Cancel the articles, and you cancel our services with them. From that moment we cease to have the honor to hold rank in the navies of the King of France. There was a murmur of approval from his 3 captains. Rivarol glanced at them, checkmated. In effect, Monsieur de Cousset was beginning timidly. In effect, monsieur, this is your doing. The Baron flashed on him, glad to have someone upon whom he could fasten the sharp fangs of his irritation. You should be broke for it. You bring the King's service into disrepute. You force me, His Majesty's representative, into an impossible position. Is it impossible to award us 1/5 share? Quoth Captain Blood sulkily. In that case, there is no need for beat or for injuries to Monsieur de Cousset. Monsieur de Cousset knows that we would not have come for less. We depart again upon your assurance that you cannot award us more. And things are as they would have been if Monsieur de Cousset had adhered rigidly to his instructions. I have proved, I hope, to your satisfaction, Monsieur le Baron, that if you repudiate the articles, you can neither claim our services nor hinder our departure, not in honor. Not in honor, sir? To the devil with your insolence! Do you imply that any course that were not in honor would be possible to me? "I do not imply it because it would not be possible," said Captain Blood. "We should see to that. It is, my General, for you to say whether the articles are repudiated." The Baron sat down. "I will consider the matter," he said sullenly. "You shall be advised of my resolve." Captain Blood rose. His officers rose with him. Captain Blood bowed. "Monsieur le Baron," said he. Then he and his buccaneers removed themselves from the august and irate presence of the General of the King's armies by land and sea in America. You conceive that there followed for Monsieur de Cussy an extremely bad quarter of an hour. Monsieur de Cussy, in fact, deserves your sympathy. His self-sufficiency was blown from him by the haughty Monsieur de Rivarol, as down from a thistle by the winds of autumn. The General of the King's armies abused him, this man who was governor of Hispaniola, as if he were a lackey. Monsieur de Cussy defended himself by urging the thing that Captain Blood had so admirably urged already on his behalf, that, if the terms he had made with the buccaneers were not confirmed, there was no harm done. Monsieur de Rivarol bullied and browbeat him into silence. Having exhausted abuse, the Baron proceeded to indignities. Since he accounted that Monsieur de Cussy had proved himself unworthy of the post he held, Monsieur de Rivarol took over the responsibilities of the post for as long as he might remain in Hispaniola, and to give effect to this, he began by bringing soldiers from his ships, and setting his own guard in Monsieur de Cussy's castle. Out of this, trouble followed quickly. Wolverstone, coming ashore next morning in the picturesque garb that he affected, his head swathed in a coloured handkerchief, was jeered at by an officer of the newly landed French troops. Not accustomed to derision, Wolverstone replied in kind and with interest. The officer passed to insult, and Wolverstone struck him a blow that felled him, and left him with only half of his poor senses. Within the hour, the matter was reported to Monsieur de Rivarol, and before noon, by Monsieur de Rivarol's orders, Wolverstone was under arrest in the castle. The Baron had just sat down to dinner with Monsieur de Cussy when the negro who waited on them announced Captain Blood. Peevishly, Monsieur de Rivarol bade him be admitted, and there entered now into his presence a spruce and modish gentleman, dressed with care and sombre richness in black and silver, his swarthy, clear-cut face scrupulously shaven, his long black hair in ringlets that fell to a collar of fine point. In his right hand, the gentleman carried a broad black hat with a scarlet ostrich plume, in his left hand an ebony cane. His stockings were of silk, a bunch of ribbons masked his garters, and the black rosettes of his shoes were finely edged with gold. For a moment, Monsieur de Rivarol did not recognize him, for Blood looked younger by 10 years than yesterday. But the vivid blue eyes under their level black brows were not to be forgotten, and they proclaimed him for the man announced even before he had spoken. His resurrected pride had demanded that he should put himself on an equality with the Baron and advertise that equality by his exterior. "I come inopportunely," he courteously excused himself. "My apologies. My business could not wait. It concerns Monsieur de Cussy, Captain Wolverstone of the Lachesis, whom you have placed under arrest." "It was I who placed him under arrest," said Monsieur de Rivarol. "Indeed, but I thought that Monsieur de Cussy was governor of Hispaniola." "Whilst I am here, monsieur, I am the supreme authority. It is as well that you should understand it." "Perfectly. But it is not possible that you are aware of the mistake that has been made." "Mistake, do you say?" "I say mistake. On the whole, it is polite of me to use that word. Also, it is expedient. It will save discussions. Your people have arrested the wrong man, Monsieur de Rivarol. Instead of the French officer, who used the grossest provocation, they have arrested Captain Wolverstone. It is a matter which I beg you to reverse without delay." Monsieur de Rivarol's hawk face flamed scarlet. His dark eyes bulged. "Sir, you are insolent. but of an insolence that is intolerable." Normally a man of the utmost self-possession, he was so rudely shaken now that he actually stammered. "Monsieur le Baron, you waste words. This is the new world. It is not merely new, it is novel to one reared amid the superstitions of the old. That novelty you have not yet had time, perhaps, to realize. Therefore I overlook the offensive epithet you have used. But justice is justice in the new world as in the old, and injustice as intolerable here as there. Now justice demands the enlargement of my officer, and the arrest and punishment of yours. That justice I invite you with submission to administer." "With submission?" snorted the Baron in furious scorn. "With the utmost submission, monsieur. But at the same time I will remind Monsieur le Baron that my buccaneers number 800, your troops 500, and Monsieur de Cussy will inform you of the interesting fact that any one buccaneer is equal in action to at least 3 soldiers of the line. I am perfectly frank with you, monsieur, to save time and hard words. Either Captain Wolverstone is instantly set at liberty, or we must take measures to set him at liberty ourselves. The consequences may be appalling. But it is as you please, Monsieur le Baron. You are the supreme authority. It is for you to say." Monsieur de Rivarol was white to the lips. In all his life he had never been so bearded and defied. But he controlled himself. "You will do me the favour to wait in the anteroom, Monsieur le Capitaine. I desire a word with Monsieur de Cussy. You shall presently be informed of my decision." When the door had closed, the Baron loosed his fury upon the head of Monsieur de Cussy. "So these are the men you have enlisted in the King's service, the men who are to serve under me? Men who do not serve, but dictate, and this before the enterprise that has brought me from France is even under way. What explanations do you offer me, Monsieur de Cussy? I warn you that I am not pleased with you. I am, in fact, as you may perceive, exceedingly angry." The governor seemed to shed his chubbiness. He drew himself stiffly erect. "Your rank, monsieur, does not give you the right to rebuke me, nor do the facts. I have enlisted for you the men that you desired me to enlist. It is not my fault if you do not know how to handle them better. As Captain Blood has told you, this is the new world." So, Monsieur de Rivarol smiled malignantly. "Not only do you offer no explanation, but you venture to put me in the wrong. Almost I admire your temerity. But there," he waved the matter aside. He was supremely sardonic. "It is, you tell me, the new world, and new worlds, new manners, I suppose. In time I may conform my ideas to this new world, or I may conform this new world to my ideas." He was menacing on that. "For the moment I must accept what I find. It remains for you, monsieur, who have experience of these savage byways, to advise me out of that experience how to act." "Monsieur le Baron, it was a folly to have arrested the buccaneer captain. It would be madness to persist. We have not the forces to meet force. In that case, monsieur, perhaps you will tell me what we are to do with regard to the future. Am I to submit at every turn to the dictates of this man Blood? Is the enterprise upon which we are embarked to be conducted as he decrees? Am I, in short, the King's representative in America, to be at the mercy of these rascals?" "Oh, by no means. I am enrolling volunteers here in Hispaniola, and I am raising a corps of negroes. I compute that when this is done, we shall have a force of 1,000 men, the buccaneers apart." "But in that case, why not dispense with them?" "Because they will always remain the sharp edge of any weapon that we forge. In the class of warfare that lies before us, they are so skilled that what Captain Blood has just said is not an overstatement. A buccaneer is equal to 3 soldiers of the line. At the same time, we shall have a sufficient force to keep them in control. For the rest, monsieur, they have certain notions of honor. They will stand by their articles. and so that we deal justly with them, they will deal justly with us and give us no trouble. I have experience of them, and I pledge you my word for that." Monsieur de Rivarol condescended to be mollified. It was necessary that he should save his face, and in a degree the governor afforded him the means to do so, as well as a certain guarantee for the future in the further force he was raising. "Very well," said he. "Be so good as to recall this Captain Blood." The captain came in, assured and very dignified. Monsieur de Rivarol found him detestable, but dissembled it. "Monsieur le Capitaine, I have taken counsel with Monsieur le Gouverneur. From what he tells me, it is possible that a mistake has been committed. Justice, you may be sure, shall be done. To ensure it, I shall preside myself over a council to be composed of 2 of my senior officers, yourself and an officer of yours. This council shall hold at once an impartial investigation into the affair, and the offender, the man guilty of having given provocation, shall be punished." Captain Blood bowed. It was not his wish to be extreme. "Perfectly, Monsieur le Baron. And now, sir, you have had the night for reflection in this matter of the articles. Am I to understand that you confirm or that you repudiate them?" Monsieur de Rivarol's eyes narrowed. His mind was full of what Monsieur de Cussy had said, that these buccaneers must prove the sharp edge of any weapon he might forge. He could not dispense with them. He perceived that he had blundered tactically in attempting to reduce the agreed share. Withdrawal from a position of that kind is ever fraught with loss of dignity. But there were those volunteers that Monsieur de Cussy was enrolling to strengthen the hand of the King's general. Their presence might admit anon of the reopening of this question. Meanwhile, he must retire in the best order possible. "I have considered that too," he announced, "and, whilst my opinion remains unaltered, I must confess that since Monsieur de Cussy has pledged us, it is for us to fulfill the pledges. The articles are confirmed, sir." Captain Blood bowed again. In vain Monsieur de Rivarol looked searchingly for the least trace of a smile of triumph on those firm lips. The buccaneer's face remained of the utmost gravity. Wolverstone was set at liberty that afternoon, and his assailant sentenced to 2 months' detention. Thus harmony was restored. But it had been an unpromising beginning, and there was more to follow shortly of a similar discordant kind. Blood and his officers were summoned a week later to a council which sat to determine their operations against Spain. Monsieur de Rivarol laid before them a project for a raid upon the wealthy Spanish town of Cartagena. Captain Blood professed astonishment. Sourly invited by Monsieur de Rivarol to state his grounds for it, he did so with the utmost frankness. "Were I general of the King's armies in America," said he, "I should have no doubt or hesitation as to the best way in which to serve my royal master and the French nation. That which I think will be obvious to Monsieur de Cussy, as it is to me, is that we should at once invade Spanish Hispaniola and reduce the whole of this fruitful and splendid island into the possession of the King of France." "That may follow," said Monsieur de Rivarol. "It is my wish that we begin with Cartagena." "You mean, sir, that we are to sail across the Caribbean on an adventurous expedition, neglecting that which lies here at our very door. In our absence, a Spanish invasion of French Hispaniola is possible. If we begin by reducing the Spaniards here, that possibility will be removed. We shall have added to the crown of France the most coveted possession in the West Indies. The enterprise offers no particular difficulty. It may be speedily accomplished, and, once accomplished, it would be time to look farther afield. That would seem the logical order in which this campaign should proceed." He ceased, and there was silence. Monsieur de Rivarol sat back in his chair, the feathered end of a quill between his teeth. Presently he cleared his throat and asked a question. "Is there anybody else who shares Captain Blood's opinion?" None answered him. His own officers were overawed by him. Blood's followers naturally preferred Cartagena because offering the greater chance of loot. Loyalty to their leader kept them silent. "You seem to be alone in your opinion," said the Baron with his vinegary smile. Captain Blood laughed outright. He had suddenly read the Baron's mind. His airs and graces and haughtiness had so imposed upon Blood that it was only now that at last he saw through them into the fellow's peddling spirit. Therefore he laughed. There was really nothing else to do. But his laughter was charged with more anger even than contempt. He had been deluding himself that he had done with piracy. The conviction that this French service was free of any taint of that was the only consideration that had induced him to accept it. Yet here was this haughty, supercilious gentleman, who dubbed himself General of the armies of France, proposing a plundering, thieving raid which, when stripped of its mean, transparent mask of legitimate warfare, was revealed as piracy of the most flagrant. Monsieur de Rivarol, intrigued by his mirth, scowled upon him disapprovingly. "Why do you laugh, monsieur?" "Because I discover here an irony that is supremely droll. You, Monsieur le Baron, General of the King's armies by land and sea in America, propose an enterprise of a purely buccaneering character, whilst I, the buccaneer, am urging one that is more concerned with upholding the honour of France. You perceive how droll it is?" Monsieur de Rivarol perceived nothing of the kind. Monsieur de Rivarol, in fact, was extremely angry. He bounded to his feet, and every man in the room rose with him, save only Monsieur de Cussy, who sat on with a grim smile on his lips. He too now read the Baron like an open book, and reading him, despised him. "Monsieur le flibustier," cried Rivarol in a thick voice, "it seems that I must again remind you that I am your superior officer." "My superior officer, you, lord of the world! Why, you are just a common pirate. But you shall hear the truth for once, and that before all these gentlemen who have the honour to serve the King of France. It is for me, a buccaneer, a sea robber, to stand here and tell you what is in the interest of French honour and the French crown, whilst you, the French King's appointed general, neglecting this, are for spending the King's resources against an outlying settlement of no account, shedding French blood and seizing a place that cannot be held, only because it has been reported to you that there is much gold in Cartagena, and that the plunder of it will enrich you. It is worthy of the huckster who sought to haggle with us about our share, and to beat us down after the articles pledging you were already signed. If I am wrong, let Monsieur de Cussy say so. If I am wrong, let me be proven wrong, and I will beg your pardon. Meanwhile, monsieur, I withdraw from this council. I will have no further part in your deliberations. I accepted the service of the King of France with intent to honour that service. I cannot honour that service by lending countenance to waste of life and resources in raids upon unimportant settlements, with plunder for their only object. The responsibility for such decisions must rest with you, and with you alone. I desire Monsieur de Cussy to report me to the ministers of France. For the rest, monsieur, it merely remains for you to give me your orders. I await them aboard my ship, and anything else of a personal nature that you may feel I have provoked by the terms I have felt compelled to use in this council. Monsieur le Baron, I have the honour to wish you good day." He stalked out, and his three captains, although they thought him mad, rolled after him in loyal silence. Monsieur de Rivarol was gasping like a landed fish. The stark truth had robbed him of speech. When he recovered, it was to thank heaven vigorously that the council was relieved by Captain Blood's own act of that gentleman's further participation in its deliberations. Inwardly, Monsieur de Rivarol burned with shame and rage. The mask had been plucked from him, and he had been held up to scorn. He, the general of the King's armies by sea and land in America. Nevertheless, it was to Cartagena that they sailed in the middle of March. Volunteers and negroes had brought up the forces directly under Monsieur de Rivarol to 1,200 men. With these, he thought he could keep the buccaneer contingent in order and submissive. They made up an imposing fleet, led by Monsieur de Rivarol's flagship, the Victorieuse, a mighty vessel of 80 guns. Each of the 4 other French ships was at least as powerful as Blood's Arabella, which was of 40 guns. Followed the lesser buccaneer vessels, the Elizabeth, La Chassis, and Atropos, and a dozen frigates laden with stores, besides canoes and small craft in tow. Narrowly they missed the Jamaica fleet with Colonel Bishop, which sailed north for Tortuga 2 days after the Baron de Rivarol's southward passage. End of chapter 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Crandall, Fremont, California, September 2006. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 27, Cartagena. Having crossed the Caribbean in the teeth of contrary winds, it was not until the early days of April that the French fleet hove in sight of Cartagena, and Monsieur de Rivarol summoned a council aboard his flagship to determine the method of assault. "It is of importance, messieurs," he told them, "that we take the city by surprise, not only before it can put itself into a state of defense, but before it can remove its treasures inland. I propose to land a force sufficient to achieve this to the north of the city tonight after dark." And he explained in detail the scheme upon which his wits had labored. He was heard respectfully and approvingly by his officers, scornfully by Captain Blood, and indifferently by the other buccaneer captains present, for it must be understood that Blood's refusal to attend councils had related only to those concerned with determining the nature of the enterprise to be undertaken. Captain Blood was the only one amongst them who knew exactly what lay ahead. 2 years ago he had himself considered a raid upon the place, and he had actually made a survey of it in circumstances which he was presently to disclose. The Baron's proposal was one to be expected from a commander whose knowledge of Cartagena was only such as might be derived from maps. Geographically and strategically considered, it is a curious place. It stands almost 4 square, screened east and north by hills, and it may be said to face south upon the inner of 2 harbors by which it is normally approached. The entrance to the outer harbor, which is in reality a lagoon some 3 miles across, lies through a neck known as the Boca Chica, or Little Mouth, and defended by a fort. A long strip of densely wooded land to the westward acts here as a natural breakwater, and as the inner harbor is approached, another strip of land thrusts across at right angles from the first, towards the mainland on the east. Just short of this it ceases, leaving a deep but very narrow channel, a veritable gateway into the secure and sheltered inner harbor. Another fort defends this second passage. East and north of Cartagena lies the mainland, which may be left out of account. But to the west and northwest this city, so well guarded on every other side, lies directly open to the sea. It stands back beyond a half-mile of beach, and besides this and the stout walls which fortify it, would appear to have no other defences. But those appearances are deceptive, and they had utterly deceived Monsieur de Rivarol when he devised his plan. It remained for Captain Blood to explain the difficulties when Monsieur de Rivarol informed him that the honour of opening the assault in the manner which he prescribed was to be accorded to the buccaneers. Captain Blood smiled sardonic appreciation of the honour reserved for his men. It was precisely what he would have expected. For the buccaneers the dangers, for Monsieur de Rivarol the honour, glory, and profit of the enterprise. "It is an honour which I must decline," said he quite coldly. Wolverstone grunted approval, and Hagthorpe nodded. Iberville, who, as much as any of them, resented the superciliousness of his noble compatriot, never wavered in loyalty to Captain Blood. The French officers, there were 6 of them present, stared their haughty surprise at the buccaneer leader, whilst the Baron challengingly fired a question at him. "How? You decline it, sir? You decline to obey orders, do you say?" "I understood, Monsieur le Baron, that you summoned us to deliberate upon the means to be adopted." "Then you understood amiss, Monsieur le Capitaine. You are here to receive my commands. I have already deliberated, and I have decided. I hope you understand." "Oh, I understand," laughed Blood. But I ask myself, do you? And without giving the Baron time to set the angry question that was bubbling to his lips, he swept on. You have deliberated, you say, and you have decided, but unless your decision rests upon a wish to destroy my buccaneers, you will alter it when I tell you something of which I have knowledge. The city of Cartagena looks very vulnerable on the northern side, all open to the sea as it apparently stands. Ask yourself, Monsieur le Baron, how came the Spaniards who built it, where it is, to have been at such trouble to fortify it to the south, if from the north it is so easily assailable? That gave Monsieur de Rivarol pause. The Spaniards, Blood pursued, are not quite the fools you are supposing them. Let me tell you, messieurs, that 2 years ago I made a survey of Cartagena as a preliminary to raiding it. I came hither with some friendly trading Indians, myself disguised as an Indian, and in that guise I spent a week in the city and studied carefully all its approaches. On the side of the sea where it looks so temptingly open to assault, there is shoal water for over half a mile out, far enough out, I assure you, to ensure that no ship shall come within bombarding range of it. It is not safe to venture nearer land than 3/4 of a mile. But our landing will be effected in canoes and piraguas and open boats, cried an officer impatiently. In the calmest season of the year, the surf will hinder any such operation, and you will also bear in mind that if landing were possible as you are suggesting, that landing could not be covered by the ship's guns. In fact, it is the landing parties would be in danger from their own artillery. If the attack is made by night, as I propose, covering will be unnecessary. You should be ashore in force before the Spaniards are aware of the intent. You are assuming that Cartagena is a city of the blind, that at this very moment they are not conning our sails and asking themselves who we are and what we intend. But if they feel themselves secure from the north, as you suggest, cried the Baron impatiently, that very security will lull them. Perhaps, but then they are secure. Any attempt to land on this side is doomed to failure at the hands of nature. Nevertheless, we make the attempt, said the obstinate Baron, whose haughtiness would not allow him to yield before his officers. If you still choose to do so after what I have said, you are, of course, the person to decide, but I do not lead my men into fruitless danger. If I command you, the Baron was beginning, but Blood unceremoniously interrupted him. Monsieur le Baron, when Monsieur de Cussy engaged us on your behalf, it was as much on account of our knowledge and experience of this class of warfare as on account of our strength. I have placed my own knowledge and experience in this particular matter at your disposal. I will add that I abandoned my own project of raiding Cartagena, not being in sufficient strength at the time to force the entrance of the harbor, which is the only way into the city. The strength which you now command is ample for that purpose. But whilst we are doing that, the Spaniards will have time to remove great parts of the wealth which this city holds. We must take them by surprise. Captain Blood shrugged. If this is a mere pirating raid, that, of course, is a prime consideration. It was with me. But if you are concerned to abate the pride of Spain and plant the lilies of France on the forts of this settlement, the loss of some treasure should not really weigh for much. Monsieur de Rivarol bit his lip in chagrin. His gloomy eye smouldered as it considered the self-contained buccaneer. "But if I command you to go to make the attempt?" he asked. "Answer me, monsieur. Let us know once for all where we stand and who commands this expedition." "Positively, I find you tiresome," said Captain Blood, and he swung to Monsieur de Cussy, who sat there gnawing his lip, intensely uncomfortable. "I appeal to you, monsieur, to justify me to the general." Monsieur de Cussy started out of his gloomy abstraction. He cleared his throat. He was extremely nervous. "In view of what Captain Blood has submitted, "Oh, to the devil with that!" snapped Rivarol. "It seems that I am followed by poltroons. Look you, Monsieur le Capitaine, since you are afraid to undertake this thing, I will myself undertake it. The weather is calm, and I count upon making good my landing. If I do so, I shall have proved you wrong, and I shall have a word to say to you tomorrow which you may not like. I am being very generous with you, sir." He waved his hand regally. "You have leave to go." It was sheer obstinacy and empty pride that drove him, and he received the lesson he deserved. The fleet stood in during the afternoon to within a mile of the coast, and under cover of darkness, 300 men, of whom 200 were negroes, the whole of the negro contingent having been pressed into the undertaking, were pulled away for the shore in the canoes, piraguas, and ships' boats. Rivarol's pride compelled him, however much he may have disliked the venture, to lead them in person. The first 6 boats were caught in the surf, and pounded into fragments before their occupants could extricate themselves. The thunder of the breakers and the cries of the shipwrecked warned those who followed, and thereby saved them from sharing the same fate. By the Baron's urgent orders, they pulled away again out of danger, and stood about to pick up such survivors as contrived to battle towards them. Close upon 50 lives were lost in the adventure, together with half a dozen boats stored with ammunition and light guns. The Baron went back to his flagship an infuriated, but by no means a wiser man. Wisdom, not even the pungent wisdom experience thrusts upon us, is not for such as Monsieur de Rivarol. His anger embraced all things, but focused chiefly upon Captain Blood. In some warped process of reasoning, he held the buccaneer chiefly responsible for this misadventure. He went to bed considering furiously what he should say to Captain Blood upon the morrow. He was awakened at dawn by the rolling thunder of guns. Emerging upon the poop in nightcap and slippers, he beheld a sight that increased his unreasonable and unreasoning fury. The 4 buccaneer ships under canvas were going through extraordinary maneuver half a mile off the Boca Chica, and little more than half a mile away from the remainder of the fleet, and from their flanks flame and smoke were belching each time they swung broadside to the great round fort that guarded the narrow entrance. The fort was returning the fire vigorously and viciously, but the buccaneers timed their broadsides with extraordinary judgment to catch the defending ordnance reloading. Then, as they drew the Spaniards' fire, they swung away again, not only taking care to be ever-moving targets, but further, to present no more than bow or stern to the fort, their masts in line, when the heaviest cannonades were to be expected. Gibbering and cursing, Monsieur de Rivarol stood there and watched this action, so presumptuously undertaken by Blood on his own responsibility. The officers of the Victorieuse crowded round him, but it was not until Monsieur de Cussy came to join the group that he opened the sluices of his rage, and Monsieur de Cussy himself invited the deluge that now caught him. He had come up rubbing his hands and taking a proper satisfaction in the energy of the men whom he had enlisted. "Aha, Monsieur de Rivarol," he laughed. "He understands his business, eh, this Captain Blood? He'll plant the lilies of France on that fort before breakfast." The Baron swung upon him, snarling. "He understands his business, eh? His business, let me tell you, Monsieur de Cussy, is to obey my orders, and I have not ordered this. Par le mordieu! When this is over, I'll deal with him for his damned insubordination." "Surely, Monsieur le Baron, he will have justified it if he succeeds." "Justified it? Ah, parbleu! Can a soldier ever justify acting without orders?" He raved on furiously, his officers supporting him out of their detestation of Captain Blood. Meanwhile the fight went merrily on. The fort was suffering badly, yet for all their manoeuvring the buccaneers were not escaping punishment. The starboard gunwale of the Atropos had been hammered into splinters, and a shot had caught her astern in the coach. The Elizabeth was badly battered about the forecastle, and the Arabella's maintop had been shot away, whilst towards the end of that engagement the Lachesis came reeling out of the fight with a shattered rudder, steering herself by sweeps. The absurd Baron's fierce eyes positively gleamed with satisfaction. "I pray heavens they may sink all his infernal ships," he cried in his frenzy. But heaven didn't hear him. Scarcely had he spoken than there was a terrific explosion, and half the fort went up in fragments. A lucky shot from the buccaneers had found the powder magazine. It may have been a couple of hours later when Captain Blood, as spruce and cool as if he had just come from a levee, stepped upon the quarter-deck of the Victorieuse to confront M. de Rivarol, still in bedgown and nightcap. "I have to report, Monsieur le Baron, that we are in possession of the fort on Boca Chica. The standard of France is flying from what remains of its tower, and the way into the outer harbour is open to your fleet." Monsieur de Rivarol was compelled to swallow his fury, though it choked him. The jubilation among his officers had been such that he could not continue as he had begun. Yet his eyes were malevolent, his face pale with anger. "You are fortunate, Monsieur Blood, that you succeeded," he said. "It would have gone very ill with you had you failed. Another time be so good as to await my orders, lest you should afterwards lack the justification which your good fortune has procured you this morning." Blood smiled with a flash of white teeth and bowed. "I shall be glad of your orders now, General, for pursuing our advantage. You realize that speed in striking is the first essential." Rivarol was left gaping a moment. Absorbed in his ridiculous anger, he had considered nothing. But he made a quick recovery. "To my cabin, if you please," he commanded peremptorily, and was turning to lead the way when Blood arrested him. "With submission, my General, we shall be better here. You behold there the scene of our coming action. It is spread before you like a map." He waved his hand towards the lagoon, the country flanking it, and the considerable city standing back from the beach. "If it is not a presumption in me to offer a suggestion—" He paused. Monsieur de Rivarol looked at him sharply, suspecting irony, but the swarthy face was bland, the keen eyes steady. "Let us hear your suggestion," he consented. Blood pointed out the fort at the mouth of the inner harbour, which was just barely visible above the waving palms on the intervening tongue of land. He announced that its armament was less formidable than that of the outer fort, which they had reduced. But, on the other hand, the passage was very much narrower than the Boca Chica, and before they could attempt to make it in any case, they must dispose of those defences. He proposed that the French ships should enter the outer harbour and proceed at once to bombardment. Meanwhile, he would land 300 buccaneers and some artillery on the eastern side of the lagoon, beyond the fragrant garden islands dense with richly bearing fruit trees, and proceed simultaneously to storm the fort in the rear. Thus beset on both sides at once, and demoralized by the fate of the much stronger outer fort, he did not think the Spaniards would offer a very long resistance. Then it would be for Monsieur de Rivarol to garrison the fort, whilst Captain Blood would sweep on with his men and seize the church of Nuestra Señora de la Pupa, plainly visible on its hill immediately eastward of town. Not only did that eminence afford them a valuable and obvious strategic advantage, but it commanded the only road that led from Cartagena to the interior, and once it were held, there would be no further question of the Spaniards attempting to remove the wealth of the city. That, to Monsieur de Rivarol, was, as Captain Blood had judged that it would be, the crowning argument. Supercilious until that moment, and disposed for his own pride's sake to treat the buccaneer's suggestions with cavalier criticism, Monsieur de Rivarol's manner suddenly changed. He became alert and brisk, went so far as tolerantly to commend Captain Blood's plan, and issued orders that action might be taken upon it at once. It is not necessary to follow that action step by step. Blunders on the part of the French marred its smooth execution, and the indifferent handling of their ships led to the sinking of 2 of them in the course of the afternoon by the fort's gunfire. But by evening, owing largely to the irresistible fury with which the buccaneers stormed the place from the landward side, the fort had surrendered, and before dusk Blood and his men with some ordnance, hauled thither by mules, dominated the city from the heights of Nuestra Señora de la Pupa. At noon on the morrow, shorn of defences and threatened with bombardment, Cartagena sent offers of surrender to Monsieur de Rivarol. Swollen with pride by a victory for which he took the entire credit to himself, the Baron dictated his terms. He demanded that all public effects and office accounts be delivered up, that the merchants surrender all moneys and goods held by them for their correspondence. The inhabitants could choose whether they would remain in the city or depart, but those who went must first deliver up all their property, and those who elected to remain must surrender half and become the subjects of France. Religious houses and churches should be spared, but they must render accounts of all moneys and valuables in their possession. Cartagena agreed, having no choice in the matter, and on the next day, which was the 5th of April, Monsieur de Rivarol entered the city and proclaimed it now a French colony, appointing Monsieur de Cussy its governor. Thereafter he proceeded to the cathedral, where, very properly, a Te Deum was sung in honor of the conquest. This by way of grace, whereafter Monsieur de Rivarol proceeded to devour the city. The only detail in which the French conquest of Cartagena differed from an ordinary buccaneering raid was that under the severest penalties no soldier was to enter the house of any inhabitant. But this apparent respect for the persons and property of the conquered was based in reality upon Monsieur de Rivarol's anxiety lest a doubloon should be abstracted from all the wealth that was pouring into the treasury opened by the Baron in the name of the King of France. Once the golden stream had ceased, he removed all restrictions and left the city in prey to his men, who proceeded further to pillage it of that part of their property which the inhabitants, who became French subjects, had been assured should remain inviolate. The plunder was enormous. In the course of 4 days, over 100 mules laden with gold went out of the city and down to the boats waiting at the beach to convey the treasure aboard the ships. End of chapter 27.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Siegel of Maynard, Massachusetts. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 28. The Honor of Monsieur de Rivarol. During the capitulations and for some time after, Captain Blood and the greater portion of his buccaneers had been at their posts on the heights of Nuestra Senora de la Pupa, utterly in ignorance of what was taking place. Blood, although the man chiefly, if not solely, responsible for the swift reduction of the city, which was proving a veritable treasure-house, was not even shown the consideration of being called to the council of officers, which with Monsieur de Rivarol determined the terms of the capitulation. This was a slight that at another time Captain Blood would not have borne for a moment. But at present, in his odd frame of mind, and its divorcement from piracy, he was content to smile his utter contempt of the French general. Not so, however, of his captains, and still less his men. Resentment smoldered among them for a while, to flame out violently at the end of that week in Cartagena. It was only by undertaking to voice their grievance to the Baron that their captain was able for the moment to pacify them. That done, he went at once in quest of Monsieur de Rivarol. He found him in the offices which the Baron had set up in the town, with a staff of clerks to register the treasure brought in and to cast up the surrendered account books, with a view to ascertaining precisely what were the sums yet to be delivered up. The Baron sat there, scrutinizing ledgers like a city merchant, and checking figures to make sure that all was correct to the last peso. A choice occupation, this, for the general of the king's armies by sea and land. He looked up irritated by the interruption which Captain Blood's advent occasioned. "Monsieur le Baron," the latter greeted him, "I must speak frankly, and you must suffer it. My men are on the point of mutiny." Monsieur de Rivarol considered him with a faint lift of the eyebrows. "Captain Blood, I too will speak frankly, and you too must suffer it. If there is a mutiny, you and your captain shall be held personally responsible. The mistake you make is in assuming with me the tone of an ally, whereas I have given you clearly to understand from the first that you are simply in the position of having accepted service under me. Your proper apprehension of that fact will save the waste of a deal of words." Blood contained himself with difficulty. One of these fine days he felt, for the sake of humanity, he must slit the comb of this supercilious, arrogant cockerel. "You may define our positions as you please," said he, "but I'll remind you that the nature of a thing is not changed by the name you give it. I am concerned with facts, chiefly with the fact that we entered into definite articles with you. Those articles provided for a certain distribution of the spoils. My men demand it. They are not satisfied. Of what are they not satisfied? Demanded the Baron. Of your honesty, Monsieur de Rivarol. A blow in the face could scarcely have taken the Frenchman more aback. He stiffened and drew himself up, his eyes blazing, his face of a deathly pallor. The clerks at the tables laid down their pens and awaited the explosion in a sort of terror. For a moment there was silence. Then the great gentleman delivered himself in a voice of concentrated anger. Do you really dare so much? You and the dirty thieves that follow you? God's blood! You shall answer to me for that word, though it entail yet worse dishonor to meet you. Faugh! I will remind you, said Blood, that I am speaking not for myself, but for my men. It is they who are not satisfied, they who threaten that unless satisfaction is afforded them, and promptly, they will take it. Take it? Said Rivarol, trembling in rage. Let them attempt it, and... Now don't be rash. My men are within their rights, as you are aware. They demand to know when this sharing of the spoil is to take place, and when they are to receive the fifth for which their articles provide. God give me patience. How can we share the spoil before it has been completely gathered? My men have reason to believe that it is gathered, and anyway, they view with mistrust that it should all be housed aboard your ships and remain in your possession. They say that hereafter there will be no ascertaining what the spoil really amounts to. But, name of heaven, I have kept books. They are there for all to see. They do not wish to see account books. Few of them can read. They want to view the treasure itself. They know, you compel me to be blunt, that the accounts have been falsified. Your books show the spoil of Cartagena to amount to some 10 millions livres. The men know, and they are very skilled in these computations, that it exceeds the enormous total of 40 millions. They insist that the treasure itself be produced and weighed in their presence, as is the custom among the brethren of the coast. I know nothing of filibuster customs, the gentleman was disdainful, but you are learning quickly. What do you mean, you rogue? I am a leader of armies, not of plundering thieves. Oh, but of course! Blood's irony laughed in his eyes. Yet whatever you may be, I warn you that unless you yield to a demand that I consider just and therefore uphold, you may look for trouble, and it would not surprise me if you never leave Cartagena at all, nor convey a single piece of gold home to France. Ah, pardieu! Am I to understand that you are threatening me? Come, come, Monsieur le Baron. I warn you of the trouble that a little prudence may avert. You do not know on what a volcano you are sitting. You do not know the ways of buccaneers. If you persist, Cartagena will be drenched in blood, and whatever the outcome, the King of France will not have been well served. That shifted the basis of the argument to less hostile ground. A while yet it continued, to be concluded at last by an ungracious undertaking from Monsieur de Rivarol to submit to the demands of the buccaneers. He gave it with an extreme ill grace, and only because Blood made him realize at last that to withhold it longer would be dangerous. In an engagement, he might conceivably defeat Blood's followers, but conceivably he might not, and even if he succeeded, the effort would be so costly to him in men that he might not thereafter find himself in sufficient strength to maintain his hold of what he had seized. The end of it all was that he gave a promise at once to make the necessary preparations, and if Captain Blood and his officers would wait upon him on board the Victorieuse tomorrow morning, the treasure would be produced, weighed in their presence, and their fifth share surrendered there and then into their own keeping. Among the buccaneers that night there was a hilarity over the sudden abatement of Monsieur de Rivarol's monstrous pride. But when the next dawn broke over Cartagena, they had the explanation of it. The only ships to be seen in the harbor were the Arabella and the Elizabeth riding at anchor, and the Atropos and the La Chalice careened on the beach for repair of the damage sustained in the bombardment. The French ships were gone. They had been quietly and secretly warped out of the harbor under the cover of night, and 3 sails, faint and small, on the horizon to the westward was all that remained to be seen of them. The absconding Monsieur de Rivarol had gone off with the treasure, taking with him the troops and mariners he had brought from France. He had left behind him at Cartagena not only the empty-handed buccaneers whom he had swindled, but also Monsieur de Coucy, and the volunteers and negroes from Hispaniola, whom he had swindled no less. The two parties were fused into one by their common fury, and before the exhibition of it the inhabitants of that ill-fated town were stricken with deeper terror than they had yet known since the coming of this expedition. Captain Blood alone kept his head, setting a curb upon his deep chagrin. He had promised himself that before parting from Monsieur de Rivarol he would present a reckoning for all the petty affronts and insults to which that unspeakable fellow, now proved a scoundrel, had subjected him. "We must follow," he declared. "Follow and punish." At first that was the general cry. Then came the consideration that only 2 of the buccaneer ships were seaworthy, and these could not accommodate the whole force, particularly being at the moment indifferently victualled for a long voyage. The crews of the La Chassis and Atropos, and with them their captains, Wolverstone and Iberville, renounced the intention. After all, there would be a deal of treasure still hidden in Cartagena. They would remain behind to extort it whilst fitting their ships for sea. Let Blood and Hagthorpe, and those who sailed with them, do as they pleased. Then only did Blood realize the rashness of his proposal, and in attempting to draw back, he almost precipitated a battle between the 2 parties, into which that same proposal had now divided the buccaneers. And meantime, those French sails on the horizon were growing less and less. Blood was reduced to despair. If he went off now, heaven knew what would happen to the town, the temper of those whom he was leaving being what it was. Yet if he remained, it would simply mean that his own and Hagthorpe's crews would join in this saturnalia and increase the hideousness of events now inevitable. Unable to reach a decision, his own men and Hagthorpe's took the matter off his hands, eager to give chase to Rivarol. Not only was a dastardly cheat to be punished, but an enormous treasure to be won by treating as an enemy this French commander who, himself, had so villainously broke the alliance. When Blood, torn as he was between conflicting considerations, still hesitated, they bore him almost by main force aboard the Arabella. Within an hour the water casks at least replenished and stowed aboard, the Arabella and the Elizabeth put to sea upon that angry chase. "When we were well at sea, and the Arabella's course was laid," writes Pitt in his log, "I went to seek the captain, knowing him to be in great trouble of mind over these events. I found him sitting alone in his cabin, his head in his hands, torment in the eyes that stared straight before him, seeing nothing. 'What now, Peter?' cried the young Somerset mariner. 'Lord, man, what is there here to fret you? Surely 'tisn't the thought of Rivarol?' 'No,' said Blood thickly, and for once he was communicative. It may well be that he must vent the thing that oppressed him, or be driven mad by it. And Pitt, after all, was his friend and loved him, and so a proper man for confidences. 'But if she knew! If she knew! Oh, God! I had thought to have done with piracy, thought to have done with it forever. Yet here I have been committed by this scoundrel to the worst piracy that ever I was guilty of. Think of Cartagena! Think of the hell those devils will be making of it now, and I must have that on my soul. Nay, Peter, 'tisn't on your soul, but on Rivarol's. It is that dirty thief who has brought all this about. What could you have done to prevent it? I would have stayed if it could have availed. It could not, and you know it. So why repine?' 'There is more than that to it,' groaned Blood. 'What now? What remains? Loyal service with the English has made impossible for me. Loyal service with France has led to this, and that is equally impossible hereafter. What, to live clean? I believe the only thing is to go and offer my sword to the King of Spain.' But something remained, the last thing that he could have expected, something towards which they were rapidly sailing over the tropical sunlit sea. All this, against which he now inveighed so bitterly, was but a necessary stage in the shaping of his odd destiny. Setting a course for Hispaniola, since they judged that thither must Rivarol go to refit before attempting to cross to France, the Arabella and the Elizabeth ploughed briskly northward with a moderately favourable wind for 2 days and nights without ever catching a glimpse of their quarry. The third dawn brought with it a haze which circumscribed their range of vision to something between 2 and 3 miles, and deepened their growing vexation and their apprehension that Monsieur de Rivarol might escape them altogether. Their position then, according to Pitt's log, was approximately 75 degrees 30 minutes west longitude by 17 degrees 45 minutes north latitude, so that they had Jamaica on their larboard beam some 30 miles to westward, and indeed, away to their northwest, faintly visible as a bank of clouds, appeared the great ridge of the Blue Mountains, whose peaks were thrust into the clear upper air above the low-lying haze. The wind, to which they were sailing very close, was westerly, and it bore to their ears a booming sound which in less experienced ears might have passed for the breaking of surf upon a lee shore. "Guns!" said Pitt, who stood with Blood upon the quarter-deck. Blood nodded, listening. 10 miles away, perhaps 15, somewhere off Port Royal, I should judge," Pitt added. Then he looked at his captain. "Does it concern us?" he asked. "Guns off Port Royal, that should argue Colonel Bishop at work. And against whom should he be in action but against friends of ours? I think it may concern us. Anyway, we'll stand in to investigate. Bid them put the helm over." Close hauled, they tacked the weather, guided by the sound of combat, which grew in volume and definition as they approached it. Thus for an hour, perhaps. Then, as telescope to his eye, Blood raked the haze, expecting at any moment to behold the battling ships, the guns abruptly ceased. They held to their course, nevertheless, with all hands on deck, eagerly, anxiously scanning the sea ahead. And presently an object loomed into view, which soon defined itself for a great ship on fire. As the Arabella, with the Elizabeth following closely, raced nearer on their northwesterly track, the outlines of the blazing vessel grew clearer. Presently her mast stood out sharp and black above the smoke and flames, and through his telescope Blood made out plainly the pennon of St. George fluttering from her maintop. "An English ship!" he cried. He scanned the seas for the conqueror in the battle of which this grim evidence was added to that of the sounds they had heard, and when at last, as they drew closer to the doomed vessel, they made out the shadowy outlines of 3 tall ships, some 3 or 4 miles away, standing in toward Port Royal, the first and natural assumption was that these ships must belong to the Jamaica fleet, and that the burning vessel was a defeated buccaneer, and because of this they sped on to pick up the 3 boats that were standing away from the blazing hulk. But Pitt, who through the telescope was examining the receding squadron, observed things apparent only to the eye of the trained mariner, and made the incredible announcement that the largest of these 3 vessels was Rivarol's Victorieuse. They took in sail and hove to as they came up with the drifting boats, laden to capacity with survivors. And there were others adrift on some of the spars and wreckage with which the sea was strewn, who must be rescued. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Captain Blood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Captain Blood, His Odyssey, by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 29. The Service of King William. One of the boats bumped alongside the Arabella, and up the entrance ladder came first a slight, spruce little gentleman in a coat of mulberry satin laced with gold, whose wizened, yellow, rather peevish face was framed in a heavy black periwig. His modish and costly apparel had nowise suffered by the adventure through which he had passed, and he carried himself with the easy assurance of a man of rank. Here, quite clearly, was no buccaneer. He was closely followed by one who, in every particular, save that of age, was his physical opposite, corpulent in a brawny, vigorous way, with a full, round, weather-beaten face, whose mouth was humorous and whose eyes were blue and twinkling. He was well dressed, without fripperies, and bore with him an air of vigorous authority. As the little man stepped from the ladder into the waist, whither Captain Blood had gone to receive him, his sharp, ferrety dark eyes swept the uncouth ranks of the assembled crew of the Arabella. "And where the devil may I be now?" he demanded irritably. "Are you English, or what the devil are you?" "Myself, I have the honor to be Irish, sir. My name is Blood, Captain Peter Blood, and this is my ship, the Arabella, all very much at your service." "Blood?" shrilled the little man. "Oh, Splud! A pirate!" He swung to the colossus who followed him. "A damned pirate, Vanderkoolen! Rend my vitals, but we're come from Skyla to Charybdis." "So?" said the other, gutturally, and again, "So?" Then the humor of it took him, and he yielded to it. "Damn! What's to laugh at, you porpoise?" spluttered Mulberry Coat. "A fine tale this'll make at home. Admiral Vanderkoolen first loses his fleet in the night, then has his flagship fired under him by a French squadron, and ends all by being captured by a pirate. I'm glad you find it matter for laughter. since for my sins I happen to be with you. I'm damned if I do." "There's a misapprehension, if I may be so bold as to point it out," put in Blood quietly. "You are not captured, gentlemen. You are rescued. When you realize it, perhaps it will occur to you to acknowledge the hospitality I am offering you. It may be poor, but it is the best at my disposal." The fierce little gentleman stared at him. "Damn! Do you permit yourself to be ironical?" He disapproved him, and, possibly with a view to correcting any such tendency, proceeded to introduce himself. "I am Lord Willoughby, King William's Governor-General of the West Indies, and this is Admiral van der Kuylen, Commander of His Majesty's West Indian Fleet, at present mislaid somewhere in this damned Caribbean Sea." "King William," quoth Blood, and he was conscious that Pitt and Dyke, who were behind him, now came edging nearer, sharing his own wonder. "And who may be King William, and of what may he be king?" "What's that?" In a wonder greater than his own, Lord Willoughby stared back at him. At last, "I am alluding to His Majesty King William III, William of Orange, who, with Queen Mary, has been ruling England for 2 months and more." There was a moment's silence, until Blood realized what he was being told. "Do you mean, sir, that they've roused themselves at home and kicked out that scoundrel James and his gang of ruffians?" Admiral van der Kuylen nudged his lordship, a humorous twinkle in his blue eyes. "His politics are very sound, I think," he growled. His lordship's smile brought lines like gashes into his leathery cheeks. "Slife, haven't you heard? Where the devil have you been at all?" "Out of touch with the world for the last 3 months, said Blood. "Stab me, you must have been. And in that 3 months the world has undergone some changes." Briefly he added an account of them. King James was fled to France and living under the protection of King Louis, and therefore, and for other reasons, England had joined the league against her, and was now at war with France. That was how it happened that the Dutch admiral's flagship had been attacked by Monsieur de Rivarol's fleet that morning, from which it clearly followed that in his voyage from Cartagena the Frenchman must have spoken some ship that gave him the news. After that, with renewed assurances that aboard his ship they should be honorably entreated, Captain Blood led the Governor-General and the Admiral to his cabin, what time the work of rescue went on. The news he had received had set Blood's mind in a turmoil. If King James was dethroned and banished, there was an end to his own outlawry for his alleged share in an earlier attempt to drive out that tyrant. It became possible for him to return home and take up his life again at the point where it was so unfortunately interrupted 4 years ago. He was dazzled by the prospect so abruptly opened out to him. The thing so filled his mind, moved him so deeply, that he must afford it expression. In doing so, more than he knew or intended, to the astute little gentleman who watched him so keenly the while. "Go home, if you will," said his lordship, when Blood paused. "You may be sure that none will harass you on the score of your piracy, considering what it was done that drove you to it. But why be in haste? We have heard of you, to be sure, and we know of what you are capable upon the seas. Here is a great chance for you, since you declare yourself sick of piracy. Should you choose to serve King William out here during this war, your knowledge of the West Indies should render you a very valuable servant to His Majesty's government, which you would not find ungrateful. You should consider it. Damn, sir, I repeat, it is a great chance you are given. That your lordship gives me, Blood amended, I am very grateful, but at the moment, I confess, I can consider nothing but this great news. It alters the shape of the world. I must accustom myself to it as it now is, before I can determine my own place in it. Pitt came in to report that the work of rescue was at an end, and the men picked up, some 45 in all, safe aboard the 2 buccaneer ships. He asked for orders. Blood rose. I am negligent of your lordship's concerns in my consideration of my own. You'll be wishing me to land you at Port Royal. At Port Royal? The little man squirmed wrathfully on his seat. Wrathfully, and at length he informed Blood that they had put into Port Royal last evening to find its deputy governor absent. He had gone on some wild goose chase to Tortuga after buccaneers, taking the whole of the fleet with him. Blood stared in surprise a moment, then yielded to laughter. He went, I suppose, before news reached him of the change of government at home and the war with France. He did not, snapped Willoughby. He was informed of both, and also of my coming before he set out. Oh, impossible. So I should have thought, but I have the information from a Major Mallard whom I found in Port Royal, apparently governing in this fool's absence. But is he mad to leave his post at such a time? Blood was amazed. Taking the whole fleet with him, pray remember, and leaving the place open to French attack. That is the sort of deputy governor that the late government thought fit to appoint, an epitome of its misrule, damn. He leaves Port Royal unguarded, save by a ramshackle fort that can be reduced to rubble in an hour. Stab me! It's unbelievable! The lingering smile faded from Blood's face. Is Rivarol aware of this? He cried sharply. It was the Dutch admiral who answered him. Would he go there if he were not? Monsieur de Rivarol, he takes some of our men prisoners. Perhaps they tell him. Perhaps he make them tell. It is a great opportunity. His lordship snarled like a mountain cat. That rascal bishop shall answer for it with his head if there's any mischief done through this desertion of his post. What if it were deliberate, eh? What if he were more knave than fool? What if this is his way of serving King James, from whom he held his office? Captain Blood was generous. Hardly so much. It was just vindictiveness that urged him. It's myself he's hunting at Tortuga, my lord. But I'm thinking that while he's about it, I'd best be looking after Jamaica for King William. He laughed with more mirth than he had used in the last 2 months. Set a course for Port Royal, Jeremy, and make all speed. We'll be level yet with Monsieur de Rivarol, and wipe off some other scores at the same time. Both Lord Willoughby and the Admiral were on their feet. "But you are not equal to it, damme!" cried his lordship. "Any one of the Frenchman's 3 ships is a match for both of yours, my man." "In guns, aye," said Blood, and he smiled. "But there's more than guns that matter in these affairs. If your lordship would like to see an action fought at sea as an action should be fought, this is your opportunity." Both stared at him. "But the odds," his lordship insisted. "It'd be impossible," said Van der Kuylen, shaking his great head. "Seamanship is important, but guns is guns. If I can't defeat him, I can sink my own ships in the channel and block him until Bishop gets back from his wild goose chase with the squadron, or until your own fleet turns up." "And what good will that be, pray?" demanded Willoughby. "I'll be after telling you. Rivarol is a fool to take this chance, considering what he's got aboard. He carried in his hold the treasure plundered from Cartagena, amounting to 40 million livres. They jumped at the mention of that colossal sum. He has got into Port Royal with it. Whether he defeats me or not, he doesn't come out of Port Royal with it again. And sooner or later, that treasure shall find its way into King William's coffers. After, say, 1/5 share shall have been paid to my buccaneers. Is that agreed, Lord Willoughby?" His lordship stood up, and, shaking back the cloud of lace from his wrist, held out a delicate white hand. "Captain Blood, I discover greatness in you," said he. "Sure, it's your lordship has the fine sight to perceive it," laughed the captain. Yes, but how will you do it?" growled Van der Kuylen. "Come on deck, and it's a demonstration I'll be giving you before the day's much older." End of chapter 29. Read by Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California for LibriVox, Spring 2007.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, March 2007. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 30. The Last Fight of the Arabella. "Why do you wait, my friend?" growled Van der Kuylen. "Aye, in God's name," snapped Willoughby. It was the afternoon of that same day, and the 2 buccaneer ships rocked gently with idly flapping sails under the lee of the long spit of land forming the great natural harbour of Port Royal, and less than a mile from the straits leading into it, which the fort commanded. It was 2 hours and more since they had brought up thereabouts, having crept thither unobserved by the city and by Monsieur de Rivarol's ships, and all the time the air had been aquiver with the roar of guns from sea and land, announcing that battle was joined between the French and the defenders of Port Royal. That long, inactive waiting was straining the nerves of both Lord Willoughby and van der Kuylen. "You said you would show us some fine things. Where are these fine things?" Blood faced them, smiling confidently. He was arrayed for battle, in back and breast of black steel. "I'll not be trying your patience much longer. Indeed, I notice already a slackening in the fire. But it's this way now. There is nothing at all to be gained by precipitancy, and a deal to be gained by delaying, as I shall show you, I hope." Lord Willoughby eyed him suspiciously. "You think that in the meantime Bishop may come back, or Admiral van der Kuylen's fleet appear?" "Sure now, I'm thinking nothing of the kind. What I'm thinking is that in this engagement with the fort Monsieur de Rivarol, who's a lubberly fellow, as I've reason to know, will be taking some damage that may make the odds a trifle more even. Sure, it'll be time enough to go forward when the fort has shot its bolt." "Aye, aye!" The sharp approval came like a cough from the little Governor-General. "I perceive your object, and I believe you're entirely right. You have the qualities of a great commander, Captain Blood. I beg your pardon for having misunderstood you." "And that's very handsome of your lordship. You see, I have some experience of this kind of action, and whilst I'll take any risk that I must, I'll take none that I needn't. But—" He broke off to listen. "Aye, I was right. The fire's slackening. It'll mean the end of Mallard's resistance in the fort. Ho there, Jeremy!" He leaned on the carved rail and issued orders crisply. The boatswain's pipe shrilled out, and in a moment the ship that had seemed to slumber there awoke to life. Came the padding of feet along the decks, the creaking of blocks and the hoisting of sail. The helm was put over hard, and in a moment they were moving, the Elizabeth following, ever in obedience to the signals from the Arabella, whilst Ogle the gunner, whom he had summoned, was receiving Blood's final instructions before plunging down to his station on the main deck. Within a quarter of an hour they had rounded the head and stood into the harbour mouth, within saker shot of Rivarol's 3 ships, to which they now abruptly disclosed themselves. Where the fort had stood, they now beheld a smoking rubbish-heap, and the victorious Frenchman, with the lily standard trailing from his masthead, was sweeping forward to snatch the rich prize whose defences he had shattered. Blood scanned the French ships and chuckled. The Victorieuse and the Medusa appeared to have taken no more than a few scars, but the third ship, the Baleine, listing heavily to larboard, so as to keep the great gash in her starboard well above water, was out of account. "You see?" he cried to van der Kuylen, and without waiting for the Dutchman's approving grunt, he shouted an order. "Helm! Hard a port!" The sight of that great red ship, with her gilt beakhead and open ports, swinging broadside on, must have given check to Rivarol's soaring exultation. Yet before he could move to give an order, before he could well resolve what order to give, a volcano of fire and metal burst upon him from the buccaneers, and his decks were swept by the murderous scythe of the broadside. The Arabella held her course, giving place to the Elizabeth, which, following closely, executed the same manoeuvre. And then, while still the Frenchmen were confused, panic-stricken by an attack that took them so utterly by surprise, the Arabella had gone about, and was returning in her tracks, presenting now her larboard guns, and loosing her second broadside in the wake of the first. Came yet another broadside from the Elizabeth, and then the Arabella's trumpeter sent a call across the water, which Hagthorpe perfectly understood. "On now, Jeremy!" cried Blood. "Straight into them before they recover their wits. Stand by there. Prepare to board. Hayton, the grapnels, and pass the word to the gunner in the prow to fire as fast as he can load." He discarded his feathered hat, and covered himself with a steel headpiece, which a negro lad brought him. He meant to lead this boarding party in person. Briskly he explained himself to his 2 guests. "Boarding is our only chance here. We are too heavily outgunned." Of this the fullest demonstration followed quickly. The Frenchmen having recovered their wits at last, both ships swung broadside on, and concentrating upon the Arabella as the nearer and heavier, and therefore more immediately dangerous of their 2 opponents, volleyed upon her jointly at almost the same moment. Unlike the buccaneers, who had fired high to cripple their enemies above decks, the French fifed low to smash the hull of their assailant. The Arabella rocked and staggered under that terrific hammering, although Pitt kept her headed towards the French so that she should offer the narrowest target. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, then she plunged forward again, her beakhead in splinters, her forecastle smashed, and a gaping hole forward that was only just above the waterline. Indeed, to make her safe from bilging, Blood ordered a prompt jettisoning of the forward guns, anchors and water casks, and whatever else was movable. Meanwhile, the Frenchmen going about gave a like reception to the Elizabeth. The Arabella, indifferently served by the wind, pressed forward to come to grips. But before she could accomplish her object, the Victorieuse had loaded her starboard guns again, and pounded her advancing enemy with a second broadside at close quarters. Amid the thunder of cannon, the rending of timbers, and the screams of maimed men, the half-necked Arabella plunged and reeled into the cloud of smoke that concealed her prey, and then from Hayton went up the cry that she was going down by the head. Blood's heart stood still, and then in that very moment of his despair, the blue and gold flank of the Victorieuse loomed through the smoke. But even as he caught that enheartening glimpse, he perceived, too, how sluggish now was their advance, and how with every second it grew more sluggish. They must sink before they reached her. Thus, with an oath, opined the Dutch admiral, and from Lord Willoughby there was a word of blame for Blood's seamanship in having risked all upon this gambler's throw of boarding. "There was no other chance," cried Blood, in broken-hearted frenzy. "If ye say it was desperate and foolhardy, why so it was, but the occasion and the means demanded nothing less. I fail within an ace of victory." But they had not yet completely failed. Hayton himself, and a score of sturdy rogues whom his whistle had summoned, were crouching for shelter amid the wreckage of the forecastle with grapnels ready. Within 7 or 8 yards of the Victorieuse, when their way seemed spent, and their forward deck already awash under the eyes of the jeering, cheering Frenchmen, those men leapt up and forward, and hurled their grapnels across the chasm. Of the 4 they flung, 2 reached the Frenchmen's decks, and fastened there. Swift as thought itself was then the action of those sturdy, experienced buccaneers. Unhesitatingly, all threw themselves upon the chain of one of those grapnels, neglecting the other, and heaved upon it with all their might to warp the ships together. Blood, watching from his own quarter-deck, sent out his voice in a clarion call. "Musketeers, to the prow!" The musketeers, at their station at the waist, obeyed him with the speed of men who know that in obedience is the only hope of life. 50 of them dashed forward instantly, and from the ruins of the forecastle they blazed over the heads of Hayton's men, mowing down the French soldiers, who, unable to dislodge the irons, firmly held where they had deeply bitten into the timbers of the Victorieuse, were themselves preparing to fire upon the grapnel crew. Starboard to starboard, the 2 ships swung against each other with a jarring thud. By then, Blood was down in the waist, judging and acting with the hurricane speed the occasion demanded. Sail had been lowered by slashing away the ropes that held the yards. The advance guard of boarders, 100 strong, was ordered to the poop, and his grapnel men were posted, and prompt to obey his command at the very moment of impact. As a result, the foundering Arabella was literally kept afloat by the half-dozen grapnels that in an instant moored her firmly to the Victorieuse. Willoughby and Van der Kuylen on the poop had watched in breathless amazement the speed and precision with which Blood and his desperate crew had gone to work. And now he came racing up, his bugler sounding the charge, the main host of the buccaneers following him, whilst the vanguard, led by the gunner Ogle, who had been driven from his guns by water in the gun-deck, leapt shouting to the prow of the Victorieuse, to whose level the high poop of the water-logged Arabella had sunk. Led now by Blood himself, they launched themselves upon the French, like hounds upon the stag they have brought to bay. After them went others, until all had gone, and none but Willoughby and the Dutchman were left to watch the fight from the quarter-deck of the abandoned Arabella. For fully half an hour that battle raged aboard the Frenchman. Beginning in the prow, it surged through the forecastle to the waist, where it reached a climax of fury. The French resisted stubbornly, and they had the advantage of numbers to encourage them. But for all their stubborn valour, they ended by being pressed back and back across the decks that were dangerously canted to starboard by the pull of the water-logged Arabella. The buccaneers fought with the desperate fury of men who know that retreat is impossible, for there was no ship to which they could retreat, and here they must prevail and make the Victorieuse their own, or perish. And their own they made her in the end, and at a cost of nearly half their numbers. Driven to the quarter-deck, the surviving defenders, urged on by the infuriated Rivarol, maintained a while their desperate resistance. But in the end, Rivarol went down with a bullet in his head, and the French remnant, numbering scarcely a score of whole men, called for quarter. Even then the labours of Blood's men were not at an end. The Elizabeth and the Medusa were tight-locked, and Hagthorpe's followers were being driven back aboard their own ship for the second time. Prompt measures were demanded. Whilst Pitt and his seamen bore their part with the sails, and Ogle went below with the gun-crew, Blood ordered the grapnels to be loosed at once. Lord Willoughby and the Admiral were already aboard the Victorieuse. As they swung off to the rescue of Hagthorpe, Blood, from the quarter-deck of the conquered vessel, looked his last upon the ship that had served him so well, the ship that had become to him almost as a part of himself. A moment she rocked after her release, then slowly and gradually settled down, the water gurgling and eddying about her topmasts, all that remained visible to mark the spot where she had met her death. As he stood there, above the ghastly shambles in the waist of the Victorieuse, someone spoke behind him. "I think, Captain Blood, that it is necessary I should beg your pardon for the second time. Never before have I seen the impossible made possible by resource and valour, or victory so gallantly snatched from defeat." He turned and presented to Lord Willoughby a formidable front. His headpiece was gone, his breastplate dinted, his right sleeve a rag hanging from his shoulder about a naked arm. He was splashed from head to foot with blood, and there was blood from a scalp wound that he had taken, matting his hair and mixing with the grime of powder on his face to render him unrecognizable. But from that horrible mask 2 vivid eyes looked out preternaturally bright, and from those eyes 2 tears had ploughed each a furrow through the filth of his cheeks. End of chapter 30. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, March 2007. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 31. His Excellency the Governor. When the cost of that victory came to be counted, it was found that of 320 buccaneers who had left Cartagena with Captain Blood, a bare 100 remained sound and whole. The Elizabeth had suffered so seriously, it was doubtful if she could ever again be rendered seaworthy, and Hagthorpe, who had so gallantly commanded her in that last action, was dead. Against this, on the other side of the account, stood the facts that, with a far inferior force, and by sheer skill and desperate valour, Blood's buccaneers had saved Jamaica from bombardment and pillage, and they had captured the fleet of Monsieur de Rivarol, and seized for the benefit of King William the splendid treasure which she carried. It was not until the evening of the following day that Van der Kuylen's truant fleet of 9 ships came to anchor in the harbour of Port Royal, and its officers, Dutch and English, were made acquainted with their admiral's true opinion of their worth. 6 ships of that fleet were instantly refitted for sea. There were other West Indian settlements demanding the visit of inspection of the new Governor-General, and Lord Willoughby was in haste to sail for the Antilles. "And meanwhile," he complained to his admiral, "I am detained here by the absence of this fool of a deputy governor." "So?" said Van der Kuylen. but why should Dad damn you? That I may break the dog as he deserves, and appoint his successor in some man gifted with a sense of where his duty lies, and with the ability to perform it. Aha! But it is not necessary you remain for that, and he will require no instructions this one. He will know how to make Port Royal safe, better nor you or me. You mean Blood? Of course. Could any man be better? You have seen what he can do. You think so too, eh? Egad, I had thought of that, and rip me, why not? He is a better man than Morgan, and Morgan was made governor. Blood was sent for. He came, spruce and debonair once more, having exploited the resources of Port Royal so to render himself. He was a trifle dazzled by the honour proposed to him when Lord Willoughby made it known. It was so far beyond anything that he had dreamed, and he was assailed by doubts of his capacity to undertake so onerous a charge. "Damn!" snapped Willoughby. "Should I offer it unless I were satisfied of your capacity? If that's your only objection." "It is not, my lord. I had counted upon going home, so I had. I am hungry for the green lanes of England," he sighed. "There will be apple blossoms in the orchards of Somerset." "Apple blossoms!" His lordship's voice shot up like a rocket and cracked on the word. "What the devil? Apple blossoms!" He looked at van der Kuylen. The Admiral raised his brows and pursed his heavy lips. His eyes twinkled humorously in his great face. "So?" he said. "Very poetical." My lord wheeled fiercely upon Captain Blood. "You've a past score to wipe out, my man," he admonished him. "You've done something towards it, I confess, and you've shown your quality in doing it. That's why I offer you the governorship of Jamaica in His Majesty's name, because I account you the fittest man for the office that I have seen." Blood bowed low. "Your lordship is very good, but—" "Tchah! There's no but to it. If you want your past forgotten and your future assured, this is your chance, and you are not to treat it lightly on account of apple blossoms or any other damned sentimental nonsense. Your duty lies here, at least for as long as the war lasts. When the war's over, you may get back to Somerset and cider, or your native Ireland and its potheen, but until then you'll make the best of Jamaica and rum." Van der Kuylen exploded into laughter, but from Blood the pleasantry elicited no smile. He remained solemn to the point of glumness. His thoughts were on Miss Bishop, who was somewhere here in this very house in which they stood, but whom he had not seen since his arrival. Had she but shown him some compassion! And then the rasping voice of Willoughby cut in again, upbraiding him for his hesitation, pointing out to him his incredible stupidity in trifling with such a golden opportunity as this. He stiffened and bowed. "My lord, you are in the right. I am a fool. But don't be accounting me an ingrate as well. If I have hesitated, it is because there are considerations with which I will not trouble your lordship." "Apple blossoms, I suppose," sniffed his lordship. This time Blood laughed, but there was still a lingering wistfulness in his eyes. "It shall be as you wish, and very gratefully, let me assure your lordship. I shall know how to earn His Majesty's approbation. You may depend upon my loyal service. If I didn't, I shouldn't offer you this governorship." Thus it was settled. Blood's commission was made out and sealed in the presence of Mallard, the commandant, and the other officers of the garrison, who looked on in round-eyed astonishment, but kept their thoughts to themselves. "Now we can about our business go," said van der Kuylen. "We sail tomorrow morning," his lordship announced. Blood was startled. "And Colonel Bishop?" he asked. "He becomes your affair. You are now the governor. You will deal with him as you think proper on his return. Hang him from his own yardarm. He deserves it." "Isn't the task a trifle invidious?" wondered Blood. "Very well, I'll leave a letter for him. I hope he'll like it." Captain Blood took up his duties at once. There was much to be done to place Port Royal in a proper state of defence after what had happened there. He made an inspection of the ruined fort and issued instructions for the work upon it, which was to be started immediately. Next he ordered the careening of the 3 French vessels, that they might be rendered seaworthy once more. Finally, with the sanction of Lord Willoughby, he marshalled his buccaneers and surrendered to them 1/5 of the captured treasure, leaving it to their choice thereafter, either to depart or to enroll themselves in the service of King William. A score of them elected to remain, and amongst these were Jeremy Pitt, Ogle, and Dyke, whose outlawry, like Blood's, had come to an end with the downfall of King James. They were, saving old Wolverstone, who had been left behind at Cartagena, the only survivors of that band of rebels convict who had left Barbados over 3 years ago in the Cinco Llagas. On the following morning, whilst van der Kuylen's fleet was making finally ready for sea, Blood sat in the spacious whitewashed room that was the governor's office, when Major Mallard brought him word that Bishop's homing squadron was in sight. "That is very well," said Blood. "I am glad he comes before Lord Willoughby's departure. The orders, Major, are that you place him under arrest the moment he steps ashore. Then bring him here to me. A moment." He wrote a hurried note. "That to Lord Willoughby aboard Admiral van der Kuylen's flagship." Major Mallard saluted and departed. Peter Blood sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, frowning. Time moved on. Came a tap at the door, and an elderly negro slave presented himself. Would His Excellency receive Miss Bishop? His Excellency changed colour. He sat quite still, staring at the negro a moment, conscious that his pulses were drumming in a manner wholly unusual to them. Then he quietly assented. He rose when she entered, and if he was not as pale as she was, it was because his tan dissembled it. For a moment there was silence between them, as they stood looking at each other. Then she moved forward, and began at last to speak, haltingly, in an unsteady voice, amazing in one usually so calm and deliberate. Major Mallard has just told me—" "Major Mallard exceeded his duty," said Blood, and because of the effort he made to steady his voice, it sounded harsh and unduly loud. He saw her start and stop, and instantly made amends. "You alarm yourself without reason, Miss Bishop. Whatever may lie between me and your uncle, you may be sure that I shall not follow the example he has set me. I shall not abuse my position to prosecute a private vengeance. On the contrary, I shall abuse it to protect him. Lord Willoughby's recommendation to me is that I shall treat him without mercy. My own intention is to send him back to his plantation in Barbados." She came slowly forward now. I am glad that you will do that. Glad, above all, for your own sake." She held out her hand to him. He considered it critically. Then he bowed over it. "I'll not presume to take it in the hand of a thief and a pirate," said he bitterly. "You are no longer that," she said, and strove to smile. "Yet I owe no thanks to you that I am not," he answered. "I think there's no more to be said, unless it be to add the assurance that Lord Julian Wade has also nothing to apprehend from me. That, no doubt, will be the assurance that your peace of mind requires? For your own sake, yes, but for your own sake only. I would not have you do anything mean or dishonouring, thief and pirate though I be." She clenched her hand and made a little gesture of despair and impatience. "Will you never forgive me those words? I'm finding it a trifle hard, I confess, but what does it matter, when all is said?" Her clear hazel eyes considered him a moment wistfully. Then she put out her hand again. "I am going, Captain Blood. Since you are so generous to my uncle, I shall be returning to Barbados with him. We are not like to meet again, ever. Is it impossible that we should part friends? Once I wronged you, I know, and I have said that I am sorry. Won't you say good-bye?" He seemed to rouse himself, to shake off a mantle of deliberate harshness. He took the hand she proffered. Retaining it, he spoke, his eyes somberly, wistfully considering her. "You are returning to Barbados," he said slowly. "Will Lord Julian be going with you?" "Why do you ask me that?" She confronted him quite fearlessly. "Sure now, didn't he give you my message, or did he bungle it?" "No, he didn't bungle it. He gave it me in your own words. It touched me very deeply. It made me see clearly my error and my injustice. I owe it to you that I should say this by way of amend. I judged too harshly where it was a presumption to judge at all." He was still holding her hand. "And Lord Julian, then?" he asked, his eyes watching her, bright as sapphires in that copper-coloured face. "Lord Julian will no doubt be going home to England. There is nothing more for him to do out here." "But didn't he ask you to go with him?" "He did. I forgive you the impertinence." A wild hope leapt to life within him. "And you? Glory be, you'll not be telling me you refused to become my lady when—" Oh, you are insufferable!" She tore her hand free and backed away from him. "I should not have come. Good-bye." She was speeding to the door. He sprang after her and caught her. Her face flamed, and her eyes stabbed him like daggers. "These are pirates' ways, I think. Release me!" "Arabella!" he cried on a note of pleading. "Are ye meaning it? Must I release ye? Must I let ye go and never set eyes on ye again? Or will ye stay and make this exile endurable until we can go home together? Oh, you're crying now. What have I said to make you cry, my dear? I thought you'd never say it." She mocked him through her tears. "Well, now you see there was Lord Julian, a fine figure of a... There was never anybody but you, Peter." They had, of course, a deal to say thereafter, so much indeed that they sat down to say it, whilst time sped on, and Governor Blood forgot the duties of his office. He had reached home at last. His odyssey was ended. And meanwhile, Colonel Bishop's fleet had come to anchor, and the colonel had landed on the Mole, a disgruntled man to be disgruntled further yet. He was accompanied ashore by Lord Julian Wade. A corporal's guard was drawn up to receive him, and in advance of this stood Major Mallard and 2 others who were unknown to the deputy governor, one slight and elegant, the other big and brawny. Major Mallard advanced. "Colonel Bishop, I have orders to arrest you. Your sword, sir." "By the order of the governor of Jamaica," said the elegant little man behind Major Mallard. Bishop swung to him. "The governor? You're mad!" He looked from one to the other. "I am the governor." "You were," said the little man dryly, "but we've changed that in your absence. You're broke for abandoning your post without due cause, and thereby imperiling the settlement over which you had charge. It's a serious matter, Colonel Bishop, as you may find. Considering that you held your office from the government of King James, it is even possible that a charge of treason might lie against you. It rests with your successor entirely, whether you're hanged or not." Bishop rapped out an oath, and then, shaken by a sudden fear, "Who the devil may you be?" he asked. "I am Lord Willoughby, Governor-General of His Majesty's colonies in the West Indies. You were informed, I think, of my coming." The remains of the bishop's anger fell from him like a cloak. He broke into a sweat of fear. Behind him Lord Julian looked on, his handsome face suddenly white and drawn. "But, my lord," began the colonel. "Sir, I am not concerned to hear your reasons," his lordship interrupted him harshly. "I am on the point of sailing, and I have not the time. The governor will hear you, and no doubt deal justly by you." He waved to Major Mallard, and Bishop, a crumpled, broken man, allowed himself to be led away. To Lord Julian, who went with him, since none deterred him, Bishop expressed himself, when presently he had sufficiently recovered. "This is one more item to the account of that scoundrel Blood," he said through his teeth. "My God, what a reckoning there will be when we meet!" Major Mallard turned away his face that he might conceal his smile, and without further words led him a prisoner to the governor's house, the house that so long had been Colonel Bishop's own residence. He was left to wait under guard in the hall, whilst Major Mallard went ahead to announce him. Miss Bishop was still with Peter Blood when Major Mallard entered. His announcement startled them back to realities. "You will be merciful with him. You will spare him all you can for my sake, Peter," she pleaded. "To be sure I will," said Blood, "but I'm afraid the circumstances won't." She effaced herself, escaping into the garden, and Major Mallard fetched the colonel. "His Excellency the Governor will see you now," said he, and threw wide the door. Colonel Bishop staggered in, and stood waiting. At the table sat a man of whom nothing was visible but the top of a carefully curled black head. Then this head was raised, and a pair of blue eyes solemnly regarded the prisoner. Colonel Bishop made a noise in his throat, and, paralyzed by amazement, stared into the face of His Excellency, the Deputy Governor of Jamaica, which was the face of the man he had been hunting in Tortuga to his present undoing. The situation was best expressed to Lord Willoughby by Vanderkuylen as the pair stepped aboard the Admiral's flagship. "It is very poetical," he said, his blue eyes twinkling. "Captain Blood is fond of poetry. You remember the apple blossoms? So? Ha ha!" End of chapter 31. End of Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini.